That was a sensational film, and bravo to those who did it. As you can imagine, it was exhilarating working for Tom Hoving, a protean figure with seemingly inexhaustible energy. He was brilliant, mesmerizing, and temperamental. He was decisive, he was daring, but he was also quixotic. As a result, working for Tom was as unsettling as it was stimulating. He was in a continual state of creative fusion. Just look around and look at your program. There isn't a still there. If he's not moving, then the gestures are moving. He was tough. He was combative. You know, he served 5 years in the Marines. He was much quicker than any of us. He was, how to put it, self-assuredly mercurial. And to boot, he was extremely demanding. But this was okay with us because he was a real scholar. It was his style, his flamboyance, and his distinctly unacademic demeanor that tended to obscure his solid grounding in art history. It seems that Tom was forever deconstructing his real persona. He had a great eye and insisted, and not just rhetorically, that every acquisition had to be the absolute best, a true unquestioned masterpiece, especially one of a sort you would want to brag about. And brag he did. Tom was rather fond of hyperbole. But while being with him day after day left you reeling at the frenzied pace, you should have seen him looking at a work of art. Intense, quiet, and totally focused. And then hearing his comments was one of the great lessons in connoisseurship and art appreciation. Tom lived many lives, from student to Marine, to curator, parks commissioner, museum director. He was only 36, incidentally, when appointed to the Met post, and then a long, rich, and varied life after the Met. And that is when he and I, who had been very close for so long, went our separate ways. In the last months of his life, and I wish it could have been earlier, I told him that no matter what differences we might have had, and we had a few, I told him that in a funny way, I had always missed him. And that is the truth. I had learned a great deal from Tom from the very start. We were fellow curators in the early 1960s, he much more senior, of course, and we spent a lot of time together. He loved paintings, and I loved medieval art. Later, as director, he projected a sense of life lived at a higher power, filled with flashpoints of real creativity. And these lifted you up a notch and made you feel and participate in the excitement, just as he was able to convey this same excitement and deep love of art to the public, surely one of his greatest achievements. That excitement, that creativity is what helped propel the Met to new heights, and in his one tumultuous decade as the Met's director, Tom Hoving literally transformed the entire museum world. His explosive opening up of the institution to the multitudes, his launching one grand exhibition after another. I don't like calling them as he did blockbusters. They were huge, they were hugely popular, but they were no less serious and scholarly for that. All of this was a sea change. And just look around you, everywhere in the museum world, there has been no turning back. And if you look now literally around you, the mark of Tom Hoving is everywhere at the Metropolitan. For example, right here in the Temple of Dendur, being at the Met and not on the banks of the Potomac. In the master plan launched with Kevin Roach, and that it was my privilege to complete, with a little tweaking here and there. And for all the abuse that Tom took from the press and his more conservative colleagues as an inveterate populist and popularizer, creator of happenings, of hype, an image that he, in a perverse way, helped bring upon himself, Tom was actually meeting the changing expectations of his generation, albeit always a step ahead of the pack. I remember Tom's first executive briefing with senior staff, a weekly event, an event it was, where very short words were used unsparingly, as were long ones too. A bunch of troglodytes was what he called the neighbors and the agencies that tried to block his building plans. The first week of his directorship, at his first staff briefing, he held up a blank sheet of paper and, presaging much of his future policies, complained that this was the exhibition schedule he had inherited. Not a single show planned. Nothing, niente, he said. That is when he must have invented the show in the presence of kings, that wonderful exhibition entirely drawn from the collection, a daring initiative that brought all departments together. You know, it is always easier to borrow from faraway museums than from one's own highly protective curatorial departments. And he was the first to place great emphasis on the presentation, to create maximum drama. And from this experience was born the design department, which proved such a huge asset thereafter, not only for exhibitions, but also for the permanent installations. Tom formed the first alliance with other museums and other countries, a practice that is now the rage. First France, out of which came the birth of Impressionism and medieval tapestry, and with the Soviet Union, which led to the Scythian gold exhibition, the first time the Hermitage lent from its fabled gold room. Tom's acquisitions, in which he took as much pleasure as in competing for them with the National Gallery's Carter Brown or Cleveland Sherman Lee, included, and I'll just name three, that incomparable 12th century masterpiece, the Ivory Cross from Bury St. Edmunds, which he acquired when he was still a curator, the ill-starred Euphronius crater, about which Cicero would simply have said, O tempora, o mores, and Juan de Pareja of Velázquez, one of the most convincing physical presences in all of painting, and by many a yardstick, perhaps the single greatest painting here at the Metropolitan. Tom placed great emphasis on modern art, which he did brilliantly with the acquisition of Henry Gelseller, who mounted the epoch-making show New York Painting and Sculpture 1950-1970 as part of the spectacular centennial exhibitions. One should note here that the role of modern and contemporary art in large encyclopedic museums everywhere has since those days quite literally exploded. At this point, I wish to bring up a subject that shows how truly visionary Tom was, and it's a subject you may be surprised I should even mention today. But as you'll see, I am not being indelicate. I refer to the ill-fated Annenberg Arts Communications Center, about which so much has been said and written, including by me, as Hoving's folly. But after the passage of time and much reflection, I believe this was actually one of Tom's most visionary ventures, a vision whose only fault in retrospect was being premature as to the medium, a building, but not the message. For on a profound level, Tom's vision of creating a center where the whole of the history of art in multiple configurations and narratives could be given life under one roof was brilliant. And here's the rub. He could not, in the 1970s, have anticipated the impending and dramatic innovations of technology that the internet was to bring about more than a decade later. The right building, as it turns out, would be cyberspace. Cyberspace, that virtual building which all museums